Grace, peace, and mercy. This is Pastor Chris from St. Stephen again. We are now looking at our final session of this Bible study, Our Suffering. So this final one, the question is, where is God in all of this? And that was kind of the starting question some folk had to start this Bible study off. In fact, I wonder if some of them felt a little baited and switched with the other stuff we talked about first. So we're going to start off by reviewing the first 4 weeks, but then asking that question, where is God in all of this, to those various aspects of suffering that we looked at. So with that, we'll begin with grief. So you might remember, and this is just good review for you if you don't, that grief is a natural response to loss. It often involves stages or tasks. Now, here is a thing to think about where God is in our grief. What if we didn't grieve? Now, on one hand, we could talk about that individually, that there'd be all kinds of components of our selfhood that wouldn't connect right, and we would be disturbed in a variety of ways. But also, what if we didn't grieve? What would that say about God? What would that say about the image of God in the people we have lost? What would that say about the importance of those things that we've lost that are our daily bread? So, of course, I'm riffing on Luther there, who says our daily bread is all that is necessary and nourishing for our bodies. So I imagine those are things that we feel are when they're lost, we feel grief towards. So what does it say about them? And what does it say about God if we were not to feel grief about human beings who are made in the image of God and who we have come to love in a variety of ways? And also those things in our life that are life-giving to us. What would that say about God? Where would God be if we did not grieve? Then secondly, we talked about lament. And now lament, as I defined it, was two different definitions. The first was lament is a tool to get us through grief. A tool to get us through grief. But secondly, it is a way to say exactly what you mean. Right? That you're allowed rough edges when you're lamenting. You're allowed to call a thing what it is when you're lamenting. In fact, that's part of the genre. You name things in a incredibly concrete way. So, for example, in the Book of Lamentation itself, which is the primary example of lament, we have talking about how a siege causes you to cannibalize children. You know, that's not something you talk about at the typical dinner time, right? This is not something you talk about when you're eating an hors d'oeuvre somewhere, but it is something that you can talk about when you lament. So yeah, the book of Lamentations is filled with lament over the destruction of Jerusalem and the people therein, and the faith that is being squashed and luckily not forgotten. But the other thing to remember is that 40%, so nearly half of all psalms, are lament psalms. So that must mean they're kind of important, this action of lament. So then asking that question again, where is God in all of this? Where is God in our lament? Well, guess what? God is there with broad shoulders and large ears. Like Barack Obama would be jealous of the size of ears God has, because God is able to hear and hold our grief, able to hold our lament. So there's nothing we say, none of those rough-edged things we say that are going to offend God, that God would not allow us to say in order to help us to walk through our grief. So then the third one we looked at on the third week, we looked at the wisdom tradition and what it said about grief. What it said about suffering. So the book of Proverbs says, look around at nature, look around at the world around you and see how it works. And if you do that, you will know that you suffer because you have made foolish or wicked choices. On the other end of the spectrum, the book of Job says, there are too many variables to fully discern the cause and effect surrounding suffering. And then finally, Ecclesiastes is a little pessimistic, or at least realistic, saying, mitigation of suffering and savoring of joy is the best we can hope for in this life. Mainly focusing on the idea that, yeah, there's going to be times when suffering simply occurs, and we can do limited amount of things to prevent that, and we can also, in limited ways, find joy in the midst of suffering, but also joy when there are the moments and lulls between sufferings. So, again, you can ask this tradition, where is God in all this? So, for Proverbs, and to a lesser extent for Ecclesiastes, God infuses existence with consequences and allows our choices to matter. Think about it when you're a kid and you're invited to do something, and later you find out that the adults made sure it worked one way or another. That you sort of feel like you've been treated as a child, because in fact that's what you are, and your choices you made didn't have any consequences. And you feel like you're not being treated seriously. Well, here's the thing. God treats us seriously. There are consequences to our choices, and that is a God-giving thing. That is what Proverbs and Ecclesiastes would say to that question, where's God in all this? God is there taking you so seriously that you can seriously mess things up. For that matter, the book of Job would respond, where is God in all of this? God is in the whirlwind, arriving to respond to Job, because Job says this astonishing thing, I will not relent until God shows up and gives account. And the wild thing is, God gives that account to Job. Holy cow. Then finally, our fourth week, we looked at compassion, which means to suffer with. And we looked that in Scripture we found 4 different ways that suffering with occurs. The big one being God with us in our suffering, but also there are times when we are with God in suffering. So we suffer because of our faith, because of the making right and good choices. Sometimes that is not the greatest thing ever, and yet it is still the faithful thing to do. Then there's also suffering with others. So us suffering with us. Human beings suffering with other human beings. That's part of the Christian calling sometimes. The Christian calling of compassion means suffering with our siblings. Then finally, there is the fourth thing that we find in the 8th chapter of Romans, this strange suffering that is universal. There's a universal mutual suffering that occurs through the Holy Spirit. So the breath of God, in fact, blows through all of us and all of creation in a way that suffering is shared. Then, additionally, we talked a bit about compassion fatigue, this traumatized indifference, that you are overwhelmed with suffering such that you can no longer bear it, even if it's not your suffering, but instead other people's suffering. Other people's suffering shapes us when we suffer with. But the other side of that is codependency, that sometimes we suffer with in such a way that we are doing tremendous harm to ourselves to no good end for the other. So a loss of self into another person. So that's the extreme of compassion, that we lose ourselves in another, and sometimes the other person doesn't even want us lost in them, and even if they do, perhaps that's not the best kind of relationship to have. Now, in response to this one, we get a similar response to Job in the whirlwind. God with us, Emmanuel. That's where God is when we consider compassion. God is there with us. God is here with us in all of our suffering. So if you are suffering in any way, shape, or form today, please know God is with you in that. So those are the 4 things we looked at, the 4 aspects of suffering: grief, lament, wisdom, and compassion. And those are 4 places, actually more than 4 places. I think we're up to 6 places where we find God in all of those things. Now we're going to move from that to one other way of looking at suffering. So my favorite theologian, Douglas John Hall, wrote a book about suffering, God and Human Suffering. And he had three major things, or at least three things that caught my eye that are worth considering. One of them, and I think this is the most fascinating to me, is suffering as becoming. So Douglas John Hall looks at what is commonly considered before the fall, so the first couple chapters of Genesis, and he noticed that there is suffering even there. There's suffering in Eden. And he says, I bet there is a reason for that. I bet those type of sufferings are probably serving another purpose for human beings. That in fact they might shape what it means to be a human being. They might more fully make a human being a human being. That if they're innate to the human condition, even before before things go south, then perhaps they serve a purpose to make a human being more fully a human being. So they might be a feature instead of a bug. So you can look online at, I have this little chart here to look through. So you can find it on St. Stephen's website. So I talk about suffering, the example of it in Genesis, then also a corollary of it to what we're experiencing right now in the pandemic, then finally becoming, what the other side of the thing might be. So go grab that chart so you can follow along with me. So the first type of suffering that we find even in Eden is loneliness. In Genesis, we of course hear, it is not good for him to be alone. It is not good for the earth thing to be solitary. And we might also experience that loneliness during COVID-19 in social distancing, in our own isolation. One of my congregants who participated in this Bible study talked about his family coming together for Memorial Day and how all the grandkids were just overwhelmed to see their cousins. And then the other side of loneliness, the sort of what loneliness can become and transition into, is becoming. What it can become is community. So how do you know the blessing of community if you've never been lonely? So just having Adam without Eve, right? This this Ha-Adam who becomes Adam and Eve. The oneness becoming two-ness, and yet that two-ness is a greater whole in the oneness. Community is something to be experienced having been alone. Right, there's, not to belabor the point, but there's talking about when somebody's went out of a relationship that they probably need some time to be alone and figure themselves out before they hop into another relationship and try to create a community. So you need loneliness for community. Then secondly is limitation. Now, in Genesis, there's the simple command that all these things are good to eat, but not that. So don't eat that one particular fruit. And we've definitely experienced a lot of limitations in this time of corona, right? Don't go out unless it's necessary. Wear a mask. Have you seen all these people who are freaking out about wearing a mask? They don't like limitations, just like Adam didn't like limitations. Sorry, not to get heated there. But the other thing to think about, so the result of having limitations is you can more fully experience transcendence. Right? That because you've experienced not being able to have things, not being a totalized force in the world, that which is beyond all things, reaching out to God then is truly being able to experience transcendence. And one of the things I wonder, and this isn't unique to me, is one of the reasons, even before Corona didn't allow us to meet in person in a building, perhaps one of the reasons that churches have not been quite as full as they once were, and of course I have this whole 3Ds thing of decentralization, demographic shift, and disconnect from wider society. There's a better word for it, disestablishment. That's my thing. But one of the things might simply be that we don't have limitations in our society in the same way. You know, our highest value to be an American is freedom, right? So because of that, perhaps our society where we can get everything on Prime, we can have things delivered to our doorstep the same day, we have Netflix and all kinds of other media outlets that can just cater to us, pander to us even at the slightest whim, that we feel as if we in fact are transcendent. Our society has created a transcendent human being, and therefore we can't truly experience the transcendent one, and so church doesn't make sense. Celebrating and worshiping a transcendent God doesn't make sense if you yourself seem to be a transcendent God, right? Sort of like that joke about cats, that they assume they themselves are gods. That's why they go to heaven and they look at God seated at the throne and say, "Oh, you're in my seat." And so too human beings are acting in a similar manner, that we eschew limitations to such a point that we see not going out for the sake of our neighbor, see not wearing a mask as tyranny, right? For that matter, we see worshiping a transcendent God to be silly because we ourselves are transcendent gods. That's the point of our society. Sorry, I'm getting a little heated there and maybe going well beyond what I intended to say. So if that's making you feel too funny, know that perhaps I am thinking too far ahead of myself. But anyway, limitations is one example of suffering, and the other side of limitations is transcendence, which isn't it great that we're able to recognize transcendence because we've allowed for limitations. Okay, so then the third example of suffering in Eden is temptation. Did God really say you can't even touch it? Yes, right? And similarly, I think all of us in one way or another, at least in a little voice in the back of our head, have heard, what's the harm? I mean, I'm fairly young, or even if I'm not young, I'm fairly healthy. Even if I'm not healthy, well, it's just me. I can maybe just bend the rules a little bit and it'll be fine. You know, there's such a low death rate. It's only been 100,000 people dead. I'm not going to be one of 100,000. There's all kinds of temptations in the time of COVID. And the other side of temptation, though, is freedom. Now, as Christians who take the Apostle Paul seriously, we of course understand freedom to be freedom for our neighbor, as opposed to simply freedom from masks, freedom from any sort of limitations. Now, the crazy thing about temptation is that we have the freedom to royally mess things up, to destroy large swaths of creation, to desecrate the very image of God in one another, to take our daily bread and turn it into refuse. So yeah, freedom is costly and dangerous, and yet it is the part of becoming human that comes from temptation. Then finally, and so this is Douglas John Hall. He's more convinced of this maybe than I am, that there is anxiety in Eden. He makes a pretty good case. So in Genesis, there's still the question of what next? You know, can I trust God? So, and if, on the other hand, the ultimate example of sin, and I think he's dead on right here. This is Augustine, this is Paul, this is Matthew, this is all over the place. How can I trust God? You know, lacking trust is a extreme example of sin. That if you can't trust that God is for you and not against you, then you're stepping into a place that will lead ultimately to anxiety. And so too in COVID time. When will things open up? I think that's a question continually on all of our minds. I know it's entered into my subconscious and unconscious to the point where I've actually had weird nightmares about opening up. I've had, Also, weird dreams about other ways to open up, renting a hotel and having individual rooms with, a certain number of parishioners so they'd be able to receive the sacrament, things like that. And I'm getting a little too personal there, but my point is there are all kinds of anxieties in the time of COVID. And so, too, one of the other ones is, every time you interact with a person who is not in your direct familial line, you have this anxiety for the next 14 days that the virus could incubate. Things could start over, and for that matter, anyone you're interacting with in those 14 days as well could get the virus, and that's a anxiety that hopefully all of us have for the sake of our neighbor. So the other side of anxiety, the good end of it, what it becomes in human beings, is inventiveness and creativity. After all, if you're constantly mulling over this thing to the point where it's not maybe entirely healthy, the good side of it is you can oftentimes figure out creative ways to deal with the thing. You can invent new ways to change and transform the suffering. So if we are caught on a thing, we might also transform it into a pearl. Right? This bit of grit in the oyster can become a invaluable pearl through creativity. When anxiety can be overcome and become inventiveness and creativity, then there is something great going on in that suffering. So those are the four suffering as becoming that we find in Douglas John Hall. The second really big thing that comes out of it, and this is straight from Niebuhr, who Douglas John Hall is a pretty big fan of, and that is the idea that on one hand, suffering is real. Like, Christians have to take into account that suffering is not, simply this thing that we can shrug off, we can ignore. No, instead it's real. That we're not, some sort of Gnostics floating outside the physical realm, and therefore we can kind of shrug things off, can shrug off the reality of suffering. On the other hand, Christians cannot also give way to cynicism or skepticism or despair. That, man, suffering's real, and it's just really real, and it's heavy, and that's the end of it. But instead, we also recognize that suffering is not the last word, that there's always one final word from Christ, from God acting on our behalf, that at the end of the day, all shall be well, and all shall be well, in all manner of things, all shall be well. Now, the question for Christians, though, is at what times are the sufferings that are real and we can deal with, we can make good out of, we can transform, we can redeem, and what are the ones that just need to be worked out in the wash, because there is only so much one can do. And this is where Niebuhr comes in, the prayer that he coined. So this is the original version here. Father, give us courage to change what must be altered, serenity to accept what cannot be helped, and the insight to know the one from the other, which of course becomes the serenity prayer that is so famous. The big thing to notice that changes between the two is the question of the courage to change what can be changed versus the courage to change what must be altered. That Christianity is not simply asking, what can we change for change's sake? But instead, what must be changed? What is an impossible suffering that we as Christians cannot accept? So, that is, suffering is real and suffering is not the last word. Then finally, the third thing to consider that Douglas John Hall thinks is super important and we can in fact find God in is, so I'm going to say this a couple times just to let it sit with you. We encounter Christ when we wrestle with decisions about actual suffering. So, we encounter Christ when we wrestle with decisions about actual suffering. Third time for those in the bleacher. We encounter Christ when we wrestle with the decisions about actual suffering. So we encounter Christ. So we find God in suffering. We find the God who is crucified, the God who is passionate, who suffers with us. When we wrestle with decisions, so we ourselves are responding to something. So it's not simply finding God with us, although God is with us in it, but also that we ourselves have a calling on our life, that we are not simply passive observers of suffering. And also that it's decisions about actual suffering. So one of the deficiencies of this whole Bible study, and I lay it before you, recognizing its limits, is I have definitely been dealing with suffering kind of up here and out there. We've not been touching events that are concrete examples of suffering. I've been a little bloodless in this series. So examples of actual so just to review one last time. Encountering Christ, so we find Christ in suffering. When we wrestle with decisions, so we make a decision about a example of suffering that is actual suffering, so not just a theoretical suffering. We're not playing armchair theologian, but instead we are. Although let me show you, my armchair here has suffered a lot. The cats just rip it to shreds. But that's a side note. Point being, actual instances of suffering, not theoretical suffering. We're not playing that we're thinking about suffering, but instead we're engaging actively in suffering. I think it's Elie Wiesel who says that not standing on the side of the oppressor is not enough. Instead, you have to be actively involved in a struggle. That passivity, that neutrality, is always on the side of the oppressor. I think James Cone says a very similar thing to that as well. So examples of actual suffering from the headline. So what I did at the end of this presentation was I opened it up. Here are examples of concrete suffering, just grabbed from the headlines yesterday. And what's the deal with them? Where do we find God in that act of suffering, but also how do we respond to this example of suffering, and where do we find God in those responses? So, how do we respond, and where is God found in those responses? So the examples I pulled out of the news: deadly racism. So George Floyd was killed horribly in Minneapolis. He was killed by that cop, even as he was screaming out that he couldn't breathe, that he was dying there. And his voice was ignored. He could not breathe. Then also there's the example of Christian Cooper in New York City, where, thank God, there was a different result. This man goes to watch birds, and he sees a dog off its leash. He asks a woman to put the dog back on the leash, and she responds by calling the cops, saying, "Hey, there is a black man threatening me here in the Rambles." I guess a chunk of Central Park. And he videotapes her, so that way it doesn't, God willing at least, doesn't become another tragic instance where a black man is killed by the cops for doing absolutely nothing wrong, or even in the instances where they're doing something wrong, they've been put in a place where there's nothing more they can do, and they are at the total abject mercy of the cops, and yet are still killed. So, question of deadly racism: where is God in all of this? How do we respond, and where do we find God in those responses? As well as another thing to pull from the headlines is the plague. What do we do in the face of plagues, this ongoing pandemic of COVID-19? Where is God in that? How do we respond, and where is God in our response? Also, economic deprivation. There's now a few headlines about unemployment beginning to kill some people. That there's such economic deprivation in the face of COVID-19 that there are instances where people are unable to have their daily bread and therefore die. Additionally, there's a question of natural disasters. There was flooding in South Carolina from Tropical Storm Bertha. Where is God in the face of natural disasters? What is our response to it? And where is God in our response? Then finally, loss of property. Just here, just on the other side of where I live in North Plainfield. So you go through South Plainfield, Plainfield, North Plainfield. Two of the people who are in our Bible study today are from North Plainfield. There was a fire that destroyed one home and then at least damaged, I don't know fully how badly, two other houses. So loss of property. In that, where is God in that? How do we respond, and where do we find God in these responses? Now, going from down to up, where is God in loss of property? And what are some responses? How could we respond to our neighbors in North Plainfield who have lost their house? I know when we had a fire literally just out the window here on the other side. You get to see my office real quick. Hope it's not too messy. Just right out there, literally, there was a fire, and our congregation responded by raising money. Other churches did the same. Our town really pitched in with that fire. I think it was 7-8 years ago now. And then where is God in that response is another question. Similarly, natural disasters, flooding in South Carolina. Where is God in that? What can we do to respond? And where do we find God in that response? I imagine the Lutheran disaster relief folk will be asking us to respond in some way, shape, or form shortly. And our response as a church matters. The fact that a church body is there and is able to respond, that we have connections on the ground at every disaster that we respond to, says something about what God does with this particular church body. Economic deprivation. Here in South Plainfield, we have our monthly food pantry. It doesn't do everything, but it definitely does something. It is helping those in need. It is providing daily bread and helping folk out when the month is longer than their paycheck and their pantry. The plague. This is a big one for everybody right now. They're just wondering where is God in this, and how do we respond? So one way to think about that is, how are we responding in a way that serves our neighbor in need? And then what does that say about God? Because one of the things, I guess, the background for all of this question of how a response points to God is Luther's description of idolatry, of the first couple commandments, is all those things that we fear, love, and trust that are not God, in fact, are idols, are false gods. But also, the ways in which we fear, love, and trust do also point to God. So fear, loving, and trusting in the face of pandemic says something about us, and we in turn are pointing to God. In fact, if we are made in the image of God, which is what we find in Genesis, we're a tzala, right? We're a stone that points that this thing is God's. We're a demarcation marker. If that is the case, and we're saying something about God, what does it say when we do or don't wear masks? What does it say when we do or don't social distance? What does it say when we shame those who do those things? What does it say when we bury our dead in the face of pandemic in a responsible way? What does it mean about meeting as church? And that's the thing that's weighing, at least on all clergy at this point, of how and when, and also why. What is the reason to meet if it's potentially going to kill people, potentially going to hurt people? What more fully honors the image of God in ourselves and in our neighbor, and what is the body of Christ in the world, the church, if it is spreading or not spreading disease. Again, I'm just riffing a bit there. But then finally, and this is the big one, at least in my heart and soul right now. George Floyd, Christian Cooper, Philando Castile, who's also in Minnesota, all kinds of folk who have been killed, whose lives have appeared not to matter because of the way our society currently deals with black men, but also black women. So, where is God in all of this? So I referenced James Cone earlier. One of the things he says is that Jesus Christ is black. And what he's saying with that is, not talking about skin color as such, but instead, although, well, that's a whole other thing, but what he's saying is the way people are treated in North America, the way African Americans are treated in North America, would probably parallel the way Palestinian Jews were treated in the first century by Rome. And that opens a whole Pandora's box of, what if in some ways America is acting as empire, and that, as I said, opens up just a whole plethora of questions to ask as Christians, especially as American Christians. But so where is God in that? I imagine God is executed as a criminal, just as so many of these people are accused of, being among sinners and yet not, as Christian Cooper was, dying, executed by centurions, in a way not unsimilar to George Floyd. And how do we respond? On one hand, white folk, how do we respond? I mean, definitely, I hope that this reminds us again and again that we can't be in a Cooper situation where we see calling the cops as just a way to deal with a personal dispute with somebody of color. I mean, that's horrendous, and yet that is a common occurrence. So hopefully that helps us to recognize that as Christians we simply cannot do that. We must consider our neighbor who will be interacting with the cops in a different way than we will interact. Even as, let's acknowledge that all interactions with the cops can be quite scary, and yet it's considerably scarier for people of color. For that matter, where is God in our responses? I guess another response I think we need to consider is how policing works. What is good and kosher? And even, I remember back to an interview of a police chief around the time of Ferguson. One of them said, you're asking us to do things we are not trained to do. You want us to be social workers and soldiers. You militarize the police. You also ask us to solve larger societal problems, but you want us to do it with force at times, and that's just a recipe for disaster. That you've put all these things on our plate, into our laps, and we don't know what to do, and the results are awful. So again, that we as a society, and especially as Christians, ought to consider how policing is done in our country, and how we have all kinds of societal problems that we simply toss to the police instead of dealing with as churches, as governments, as cities, counties, states, on the federal level. All of that is contributing to deaths like this. Then, and it's, of course, acknowledging that not everybody attending the Bible study was white, and not everybody in the ELCA is white. Not everybody in America is white, and so what's the response for people of color? And that's something I can't answer, and I just hope and I pray that y'all know God is with you in ways that are healing, even in the face of grief, in the face of lament, in all of these things. There is a God who loves you and is with you in all of this. So, yeah, again, in conclusion, where is God in all of this? How do we respond? And where do we find God in those responses? So with that, God bless you all, and I hope this Bible study and this Bible studies series has been a help in your journey of faith and in your life in this time of pandemic. God bless.